Okay, well let's get started here, and I hope we will. I'm going to try to leave time so we can have some discussion at the end about what do we do with this chapter on Melchizedek, because there's, as I told you last Sunday, this actually may be one of the most technical chapters in the Bible, at least that first half of chapter 7. As far as making just a very technical, logical argument, breaking things down. And really the writer of Hebrews is the one who does that. And he really talks about those things, and we're going to come to some of those conclusions here in a second and just reorient ourselves as we jump into tonight's lesson. But I guess I would point out many of those things, the points he makes are on things where we talked about the scriptures only have 3 short verses about Melchizedek in Genesis. And he's just mentioned this one brief time in Psalms 110. And he's mentioned, 11 times, 12 times in Hebrews. And all those things he's talking about in Hebrews are based on either those few facts that we've learned in Genesis, or that one statement that's made by David in Psalm 110, which is messianic. Or he's making arguments based upon the silence of the scriptures. And so it's just very interesting just to see how that's all done. Hey, come on in. And how you work through that and look at this. And so we really pushed through all that on Sunday so that we could really get to this week and look at the application of this that the writer is making. And this is really the big application. And so Hebrews 7 and verse 11, he has one of those therefore statements. And as you remember, that word therefore, when we read in the Bible, means you should have read everything that's up in front of it there, because he's making a conclusion based upon all those technical facts he's just went through that we went through last week. And he says, therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, what further need was there that another priest should arise according to the order of Melchizedek? And so you see his point here, right? It's a point of logic. If this priesthood were so perfect under the Levites, why would David have talked about another priesthood? There would not have been a need for another priesthood. In fact, the interesting thing is, David was talking about another priesthood in that Psalm 110, roughly 300 years after the Israelites had gotten into the land of Canaan. In the middle of what was their heyday. I mean, his son Solomon was going to come after him. That was their glory time. I mean, Solomon was going to dedicate the temple, not 25 or 30 years after he wrote that statement about there will be a priest after the order of Melchizedek that will rise up. And so, just think about what that means. God was already looking forward. This is part of God's plan to change this out, not just from the time of David. It had always been part of God's plan. And that's what this writer's bringing out for these people. And you're going to see tonight's lesson, and then when you get into Hebrews 8 next Sunday and Wednesday night with Mitch, you're going to see how the Old Testament was always pointing toward not only a Messiah, but a Messiah who was going to change things from what they were under the old law. And so here he asks this rhetorical question, what need is there for a new one if this one were perfect? And the answer is there would not have been a need for a new one. And so the Levitical priesthood is imperfect. That's what we conclude from that. And so he goes on from that and said, if the priesthood changes, what else must change? Verse 12, there must also be a change in the law. Now, another logical point here, but think about this. What if tomorrow you woke up and read that the United States has decided that we're going to appoint a king over the United States? What would have had to have happened in order for there to be a king?
A revolution?
Well, maybe, but what would no longer be valid? The Constitution would have to be thrown out. Right? And that's really the point he's making here. If there is a new high priest who wasn't a Levitical priest, what had to change? Well, everything about the law is what set up those Levitical high priests. So if that priest changed, then the law changed. Boy, that's a big point, particularly for the Jews, that's happened. And that all derives from this fact that one time David says there's going to be a new high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And that's really the argument that he makes here. And so Jesus' priesthood, then, he begins to break apart, and this is really where we were ending on Sunday, that he says, now it's evident that Jesus wasn't a Levite, right? Verse 14. He came from the tribe of Judah. So if there was going to be a new high priest after the order of Melchizedek, we talked a lot last week, Melchizedek wasn't a Levite. So, how many people did that qualify to be a priest, being not a Levite? Qualified Jesus being not a Levite, that was one of the qualifications. How many other people at the time that Jesus lived could have been a, quote, a priest after the order of Melchizedek by just not being a Levite? Oh, about 9/10 of all the people in Israel weren't Levites. So not being a Levite wasn't the real issue. It was part of the qualification he had to have. The real thing that had to show up is what we see in verse 14. That it's more evident that in the likeness of Melchizedek there arises another priest according to the power of an endless life. There's another concept for you to remember here. We talked about how Melchizedek was a man without lineage. We don't know his father or mother. We don't know his heirs. What we do know is he did not become priest because of lineage. All the Levites became priests because of who their lineage was. Aaron on down for the high priest and the Levites for the priest. The writer of Hebrews tells us that what David meant in Psalm 110 when he said that one from the order of Melchizedek would rise up is if you saw someone that had those qualities of Melchizedek, including not being a Levitical priest and who demonstrated this power of an endless life, that would be the person who's the new high priest. This is how Jesus laid claim on this priesthood. And we're going to start tonight talking about what that meant, particularly when you think about what priests did, offer sacrifices, and what that meant when we have a priest who has an endless life versus priests who did not have endless lives in the Old Testament. And so we finished up here by having the writer quote his conclusion that says, after talking about Jesus demonstrating those qualities, that you, pointing at Jesus, are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So the point of all those verses here is ultimately that Jesus fulfills Psalms 110. He's Messiah that they look for in Psalm 110. He was that king that Peter talked about and David talked about in Psalm 110 verse 1. And he was that priest that was talked about in verse 4 after the order of Melchizedek. And interestingly enough, that power of an endless life, where does that show up in this conclusion statement? How did David give us and them a clue that they should be looking for this priest who had an endless life? There's a word there he gave that's in that prophecy of Psalm 110 verse 4. What word is associated with endless life?
Eternal.
Forever. Eternal. You are a priest forever. Interestingly, none of the Jews read it like that. Sometimes we don't read it like that, but there was that word in God's Word 900 years before Jesus came that said that he would raise a priest who was a priest forever. And so when Jesus was raised from the dead to be back at the throne of God, that was a pivotal event in making that happen. And so we've talked about how important this is. I want to take just 1 second because this really will help us set up something that Mitch is going to talk about. We've talked a lot about how this priesthood of Melchizedek was not according to lineage, like the Levite priesthood was according to lineage. And that Jesus was this priest who was not a priest because of his lineage, but because of his qualities that are demonstrated and foreshadowed by Melchizedek. Psalms 110 not only talks about Jesus the King and Jesus the priest, Psalms 110 also talks about us as his subjects. Does anyone see the word in there that maybe is in this line of not thinking about lineage like the Jews would think about their religion and that being born a Jew would be born by lineage? Do you see the word up on the screen that might give you a hint as to how things might change in the future for God's people?
Volunteers.
Volunteers. Now, my friends from Tennessee read this verse and say, look, your people will be volunteers, and that means we'll be Tennessee fans. It's like, no, we're Tennessee fans, we won't be in heaven. That's what I always tell them. Just an aside. Your people will be, this is talking about this one who is king and priest. Your people will be volunteers in the day of your power. What were God's people under the Jewish religion? The religion that the Hebrews were starting to go back to. Were God's people volunteers in those days? What? How did they get to be God's people?
Birthright.
They're born. Baby's born, you're God's people. By what? By lineage. This whole thing of you're in God's family because of your lineage, you're God's priest because of your lineage. Not only was the priesthood going to change, but so was the membership going to change. And who's that open the door for? Well, I don't see anyone in this room that I think has Jewish heritage, and all of us. Because now people would not be born to be God's people. They would choose to be God's people. You're going to get into that in the next 2 weeks, pretty heavy, about exactly what that meant in order that happened. And so, while the writer of Hebrews doesn't talk about this and talking about that passage in Psalm 110, you're going to see this theme get pulled into Hebrews because the content of this messianic psalm is really the centerpiece of the whole middle, probably 4 or 5 chapters here of Hebrews. So, we're going to jump into tonight's lesson now with that background. Any questions or thoughts about this whole Melchizedek thing? Because what we've done is established that Jesus is this one that was pointed to by David, by Melchizedek, and now the writer has made that point. He's now going to move on to start talking about the so what of that, and that's where I want us to get. But any questions before we go? Everybody's either confused or they got it all, and I don't know which, but we'll
I did
keep
have a
going.
question.
Yeah.
So earlier, the Hebrew writer was kind of reprimanding them because they weren't mature enough to receive these more advanced teachings. And I thought originally it was those teachings were things about like Melchizedek, but now he's explaining more of this. Is this the meat that he's talking about? So he
It really is. Yeah, it really is, because as you really get to the end of chapter 6, he basically finishes that reprimand of them and then says, after telling them a bunch of things, now we're going to talk about Melchizedek.
Okay.
So even though he took that aside to reprimand them, he didn't withhold the information he was going to give them, but I think, in my view, is when they read that letter, they got a little shock treatment, that you need to grow up and you need to be able to think about these deeper things. But he went ahead and gave that information. And what we see revealed here is actually not new facts about Melchizedek, but how to think about the story of Melchizedek, not because it's in Genesis, but quite frankly because it's in Psalms 110. And that's really the verse he keeps quoting over and over and over and over again in looking at this, and then trying to help them to understand how they have to analyze their situation and recognize that if they're going back to Judaism, they're going the exact wrong direction. So, okay, does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Having established that now Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, the writer is going to spend here 14 verses comparing the old Levitical priest and Jesus' priest. So, this was in your questions to prepare for. So let's work out, instead of me just pulling these up on the board, let's work out these things. So for Jesus, start giving me some qualities that he talks about Jesus, and if you want to give me the counter quality for the Levitical priest, go ahead and say that one too. So I'll start you off. Jesus was eternal. Verse 16, verse 24, and verse 26, all talking about Jesus being eternal. What were the Levitical priests?
Mortal.
They were mortal. Excellent. Okay, somebody give me another one. You can do Jesus or the priest, whatever you see from your preparation or from looking at the Bible first.
The Levitical priests were many.
There were many. So what was Jesus? They were many. He was. He was one. Actually, they were many. when he said many, their sacrifices were many, and Jesus' sacrifice was once for all. If we put those two things together, put many sacrifices. Okay, what else? There's a lot said in those verses, so quality of Jesus, quality of the Levitical priest.
Jesus is perfect.
Jesus is perfect. Levitical priest,
Imperfect.
imperfect. What's another harsher word for that?
Human.
Sinful.
Sinful. And we're human as well. The mortal and human part is there, but they were sinful. They were men, and all have sinned. We know that, but he very much says sinless versus sinful. I forgot, we do have one priest. And what was the sense of many priests that was there, Andy? Since you brought that up, I was thinking sacrifices when you said that. What was the sense of many priests? And there are always a lot of priests, but what was the point of the many priests there?
Death.
They died. So they died, were replaced, and they died again. It was an endless cycle. And so who was advocating for the people? When the high priest, right? They entered the most holies and they did that. So a priest that had a long tenure might have done that 30, 40, 50 years. And then it's a new person that's going to do that. Jesus, one person for all time. What else? There's something said about this word, we talk about this word where talk about the different testament is another word for it if I gave you a clue.
Jesus' priesthood was unchangeable. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but unchangeable, and certainly the earthly priests changed, which ties into that your previous point there. They died.
Jesus also had that's exactly right. Verse 22 says what about Jesus and his priesthood? Better what?
Covenant.
There we go. This word covenant is may I say it, a very pregnant word to the Jews, talking about the covenant, right? The covenant that God made with Abraham, the covenant that God made. But it says Jesus was the author of a better covenant. So what about the priest?
A lesser one or an imperfect one?
Lesser or imperfect. Okay, this, just recognize that as a Jew, this is hitting where it hurts. Right? The Jewish covenant is not perfect. We're going to spend some chapters on that coming forward. These are introducing some things that are going to show up in the rest of Hebrews. Okay, so that's so very good in looking at all that. And if I can pop that up, see, it would have been a whole lot easier if I just did one click, but you wouldn't have been looking for this. So, just an aside, sometimes when you're studying, it's really useful to make a list like this because he's making a point here. So, I want us to make maybe the point of all of this. If I gave you one word only to sum up Jesus, what word would you use? And this
Holy. Better.
Holy, better,
Perfect.
perfect, okay? All those are good words. Which one goes with our theme of Hebrews?
Better.
Doesn't make it right, just makes it a good word. What about the priests? What that system and what they were doing there was what?
Imperfect.
Imperfect. What else?
Didn't forgive sin.
Weak. Did you read my notes? That's the word I picked, was weak. She's my straight person tonight. And what else? I hear another word?
Didn't forgive sins.
Ineffective. I'm not forgetting sins and doing that. Excellent. So, he draws out this long, wordy picture that I made a little wordier with my teaching tonight. But when we step back from that, it's like, so if I'm thinking about, I'm gonna stick with Jesus, who he said is holy, is better, he's perfect. Or because I'm getting some pressure from all those people who are Jewish that live around me to go back, and it's just easier if I just kind of sneak back out of this Christianity thing and just slip back into this. Well, this is what you're slipping back to. It's an imperfect, weak, ineffective system that basically is where you're relying upon sinful men in a covenant that is a lesser covenant that's imperfect and has been imperfect for a long time, as we'll study in the coming chapters here. So, when we think about that, and when we think about Jesus, the conclusion that the Hebrew writer would have us make, he's going to explicitly spell out for us, okay? And this is the conclusion that they would have us make. Hebrews the 7th chapter, verses 26 through 27. He is a high priest who fits our need, which is the NIV translation for that. Which actually, I usually don't go to the NIV. That's a really good translation. What do some of your translations say instead of that?
Fitting for us.
Fitting for us. So that's the same thought. We don't quite use that word fitting as much in doing that. So this is really the sense here. That Jesus is a high priest who fits our need. He's talking to those Christians. They think they need relief from that persecution, is what they're after. That's not what they need. They need what Jesus is providing them, and He is the fitting one. And He gives us a beautiful list where He gives us some of these words we've just talked about. So what's the first word in that list He gives us? He's a high priest who fits our need because He is what?
Holy.
Holy.
Innocent.
Okay, He's holy. Jesus was holy. What's that word usually mean when we study the Bible?
Sinless.
Sinless, we think about that a lot, but when it talks about us being holy, we're not sinless, so what others comes along with that? Set apart is often used with that word holy. That he's set aside, he's different, and that's part of what that word happens. He certainly was set apart morally compared to those priests. I mean,
They thought they were holy.
they thought they were, but let's go. Even the best ones of them, Samuel, his sons followed in the same pathway that the priests before him, that Eli's sons had followed. You know, all of those things that were there, even the best of them were imperfect. And it was easy to see they were imperfect in doing that. Not about Jesus. Jesus was holy. And we know from Philippians, the 2nd chapter, that one of the reasons he was holy is he had perfect obedience to God. And Philippians 2 verse 8 says that he learned obedience through the things he suffered, even to the point of death on a cross. And so he humbled himself and became holy in God's sight because of all those things. So what's the next word that he gives us here? He's holy and he's
Innocent.
harmless or innocent. I actually think innocent is probably the better translation there. And that really is that sinless. He's without evil. There is no evil accusation to make of him. And we know that. Even in his trial, they couldn't come up with one. Nor could the Hebrews this day in leaving Jesus. They weren't leaving Jesus because they were accusing Jesus of some evil. He wasn't like those human priests. They were leaving for other reasons. He's perfect for us. What's the next one?
Undefiled.
Undefiled. What's that one mean? Anyone thought about that? We see that a lot. What's that mean? We think about sinless sometimes, but there's a little different connotation to that.
Pure.
Pure. There is no guilt. There's not even a hint. There's not even a hint of Jesus's. There's not some story. It's like we're in the midst of all this political stuff going on. What's everybody doing? They're digging up stories on stuff from people's past. Right? Any stories to dig up on Jesus? No. He's undefiled. Next one.
Separate from sinners.
He's separate from sinners. What were the Levites?
Sinners.
They were amongst the sinners. And while Jesus went when he was on this earth amongst sinners because he was bringing them salvation, he didn't share in their sin. The Levites, the high priests, they shared in their sins. And so what a picture that's here. Fifth one is I think the end of verse 26 is
Exalted above the heavens.
exalted or higher than the heavens. And what's that pointing at? We've already talked about this, right? Remember that hope that we talked about as an anchor of the soul, that Jesus was the forerunner for, that we talked about he took all the way to the throne of God, that anchor, and put there at the anchor. Jesus was the one who went back to the heavens. Where were those priests that were alive in the Levitical system for the Hebrews these days? They're still in Jerusalem. Same place they've always been. And then verse 27 really introduces what will be the main theme of really probably chapter 9 and chapter 10 here, and that's what? What about Jesus as a priest and his?
He doesn't have to offer sacrifices for sins over and over.
Right, because he did it once for all. His sacrifice was once for all, and his sacrifice was what? Bulls and goats?
Himself.
He offered himself once for all. You see how the writer is making this appeal to them? Jesus is who meets your needs. Because you need someone who's at the throne of God advocating for you. You need someone who offered himself for your sin. You need someone who was pure and undefiled when he made that offering, an offering that God would respect. Someone who's holy, someone who's separate from sin. This is who you need. You don't need Judaism. It can't provide you any of those things. Yes, it's not only better. I think if I gave you one word to talk about this one, what would you say?
Perfect.
It's perfect. It's the only place we can go, right? It's the only place that we can ever have hope in doing that. He is the perfect high priest. Why would we want to leave the perfect high priest to go somewhere else? So, finally, I don't know if you've been keeping up with your Jesus is Better log, but it's time to start writing in it again. I hope you noticed that when you're reading this chapter. We got 3 or 4 of them here. Anybody want to start throwing them out here? The ones from this chapter? How is Jesus better? Verse 19.
Oh, verse 19. I was just going to say he's a better priest.
Definitely the better priest. That's the conclusion of that section. You're right. He explicitly uses this better term, or uses an analogy that you have to conclude that. Starting with verse 19, he offers us a better what? Hope. A better hope. A better hope. Verse 22 says what? He offers us a better covenant. In fact, it says he is the surety of a better covenant. Now, remember we used this word surety before whenever we talked about God making a promise and then swearing he was going to keep the promise. God's word was enough, but the swearing on top of it, but God by himself actually said, there's no changing this. Jesus is basically God giving his word and then swearing over his word that he would keep his word, that we have a better covenant. There is no place to go here. So wonderful picture here that Jesus is better, that he's the surety, he's the guarantee from God that we have a better covenant. Verse 23, he's better because he has what? What's his priesthood? Forever. Some translations say unchangeable. We talked about these priests change, they sin, yet things happen. Jesus is better because his priesthood is unchangeable. We know exactly who our high priest is, exactly what his terms and conditions are for us that we need to do to please him, and we know that he will mediate for us. Verse 24. He's better because he can do what?
Be a priest forever.
Be a priest forever, but that priest can do what?
Forgive sins.
Forgive. There's a really great phrase in verse 24.
Forgive inequity.
Is that changing?
Save to the uttermost is what I have. Unless I wrote the wrong verse down here on my thing. Was that-
25.
Oh,
That's verse
25.
25,
That's
yeah.
you were right, Michelle, and I was wrong. So I wrote the wrong verse down here. So Jesus can save to the uttermost. Isn't that interesting? Jesus can save, isn't that enough? Jesus can save to the uttermost. So whatever doubt you might have about whether Jesus could save, whatever situation that you might put forward, can Jesus save me from this? The answer is Jesus is able to save to the uttermost. And then what we said, he's been perfected forever. He's not just a high priest who's a high priest for a while, and then maybe he stumbles and there's something that happens, or maybe he dies. He's our high priest, he's perfected forever. Okay. So, this was all written to the Hebrews to help them overcome the hardships they were facing and the temptations they had to go back because of those hardships. As we talked about early on in the class, I don't know anyone in this congregation or anybody I know in my life that's ever been tempted to convert to Judaism. So we're not facing this particular set of things of trying to go back to a priesthood and other things. Now there's some other religions we could talk about that have some of that, but I'd like for us to, in just talking about some applications to this, what hardships that do we face, or have we faced ourselves in the past, that make us want to go back? That having us, when that happens, so that we can remember who we serve and not go back is really where we're headed here. But what makes us want to go back? Maybe you never have wanted to go back.
Well, if you were, in my situation, I was baptized at a later date, so, your whole life you're raised one way, and, making that change, you still have those connections to the old life, and it's hard to set those aside. But you need to mature, and you need to move on, and you need to change your focus of where your life,
Okay.
where you're headed.
So there are all kinds of things that get set before us that maybe are part of those old associations or old things that we did where we had to make a change, and some of those changes were easy and some of those changes weren't easy. But all those things are a previous life that pulls us back. And part of what we need to learn to do is when we feel ourselves being pulled, is think about, okay, well the Hebrews are being pulled to one thing, I'm not being pulled to that, but the argument's still the same. Jesus is better than whatever I'm being offered and being pulled. Tony?
Watching non-Christians prosper, and
Okay. And particularly those who prosper because of what? Would it be fair to say because of sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they're sinning and prospering, they're going to Vegas and gambling, I come home with a bunch of money, why can't I go do that, right? And those kind of things. Particularly those who prosper through sin might actually be a temptation for us to actually want to go back and commit those sins so we can have some of that same
thought, yeah.
Yeah. Other thoughts, other things that pull on us.
Well, just like the Jews family and friends, people that we know, are really supportive, and so.
So sometimes there's associations that we need to get away from. Sometimes there's associations that we can't get away from. We might have family members who aren't Christians, particularly if there's a marriage involved and other things, that's not just, we just don't pull away from that, right? That's, we have to stay engaged in that, but those can actually be draws and they can pull on us. So the point of this is, obviously we don't have a lot of time in class here, but we need to think about applying Jesus is better to the situations that we face. And these are the kind of hardships that we face, and I think as we talk about the world that we live in today, where people are going farther and farther away from the truth and are actually trying to actually get people to themselves go away from the truth and prove the things that we know are sinful so that they can go ahead and do them, it's even more challenging for us to think about that. And where will we make our stand in making that happen? The last thing, this was the question that you had, I wanted to turn this into, to just hear some of your thoughts here at the end. How does Hebrews 7 challenge you to grow? How does this chapter about Melchizedek and it pointing to Jesus being our perfect high priest who's better than everything, how does that challenge you and I to grow? Anyone have a thought on that as you prepared your lesson? Tony?
Well, if I think back to before I became a Christian, you know, I wasn't very happy in life. So sometimes when I guess, when I feel like I'm not happy lately, you know, do I want to go, should I really go back to a time where I really wasn't happy?
Okay? So, to learn to turn to Jesus in hardship. Does everybody turn to Jesus when they have hardship? Do the Christians all turn to Jesus?
No.
Why not?
I think sometimes we get mad at him for allowing something to happen to us.
Sick, not fair, you know, this whole COVID thing's not fair. We talk about all the things that we talk about. Do we lean in when things get hard and we push harder, or do we want to pull back and get away from it, right? And this really is a lean in kind of thing. Mitch?
I'm just thinking that seeing all that he's done for us, and all that God has done for us, and this high priest and king and intercessor that pleads our case every day, I find myself, I don't want to disappoint him, which makes me want to study more, study harder. And as he said at the end of chapter 5, you know, it's time for the milk doesn't cut it anymore. That if we can understand these chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then we have, and you really understand it. It's a two cup of coffee thing. I mean, you got to roll your sleeves up on this stuff. If we can get this, then we are moving on away from milk and into the meatier things, and that makes the Lord happy with us, I think.
Good. You know, I personally think about, you know, we're not as steeped in understanding what did it look like for someone to go sacrifice a bull and do all those things that were going on there. And sometimes I find myself not being as impressed by some of this language because I didn't see it, didn't understand that. And yet this chapter, I mean, he's gone through this in such detail that I need to back up and be impressed by the fact that Jesus is a high priest who shielded me from having to go through any of that. None of that I have to go through because of what he does for us now and what he did for us in shedding his own blood. And that's not, I don't want to disappoint him, but I need to learn to appreciate this more as to just how magnificent he is. And sometimes in the day-to-day, it's like, I'm going to go to church and we're going to take the Lord's Supper and I try to focus on the Lord's Supper and doing all that. But this chapter just over and over again just says, he's so far beyond anything else you can imagine in serving God. Why would you ever turn away from him?
I know we're out of time, Greg, sorry, but in the verse, 25, he lives to make intercession for us. His job, if you want to think of it like that, he lives to make intercession for us. He's next to God and he hears us, he has empathy for us, he has sympathy for us, and that's his job, to intercede for us. I mean, that's powerful language right there.
And by the way, how long is he going to be our priest?
Forever.
Forever. When he comes back again and we're all in heaven, Jesus is still our priest. He's still there at the right hand of God for us. And it's like, that's his job forever. And he loves it, right? He lives to do that. It wasn't that, oh, he's got to go to work today and do this, right? This is what he wants to do. He wants us there so much. So why would you turn away?
It's awesome.
Why would you turn away? Appreciate everybody. We're having a switch of teachers for the next 2 weeks. Mitch is taking over. You get a break from me, and you probably take a big relief for that. And hopefully we won't be in quite such technical language in the next couple of chapters here, but as Mitch just told you, they're deep. 8, 9, and 10, they're deep. So get your wading boots on.
Yep.
Thank you.